Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Connect Leaders series. We've got Paul Ruppert today, who is from Global Point View, strategy consultant in the telecommunications industry. For me, this conversation is all about, what technology and innovation can kind of do, and the ever increasing and ever growing kind of possibilities of that. And Paul's someone that is very, very inspirational in that area. So without further ado, here's Paul. Thank you. Hi there, Paul. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, David. How about yourself? Great to be here.
Very well, very well. It's good to speak to you over there in near Washington D.C., Maryland. So always great to hear from the other side of the Atlantic. We're expecting a big storm in Reading in a
Oh,
few
really? Like a
few
storm being
hours.
lots of snow?
And no, I think wind. I think there's going to be wind and
Oh,
rain.
okay.
So yeah, Storm Eunice. I'm sure it's not going to be anything up to an American standard storm. No hurricanes here, but you never know. But yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm looking
Or
out for
black
that.
flags like they have in Hong Kong. Who
Exactly.
knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just for our listeners' benefits, we've got Paul Ruppert here, who's from Global Point View. He is a technology consultant, but really, what he is about is the communications background that he has really allows him to work with a wide variety of clients. We've spoken, Paul and myself, about his work within the private and the public sector with startups all the way through to billion-dollar valuations, and working with big companies such as AT&T and other blue chip organizations both in America and worldwide. So we're really lucky to have him here. Hi there, Paul. Just before we kind of start the conversation, it's just really good. I mean, you're a guy with really, really good leadership experience, and that's something that we really focus on this podcast. One of the things I was quite kind of interested in is obviously you've worked within your consultancy area, and when people look at your bio, they'll see obviously you've also worked with these big corporates. Do you find that leadership is different in these different kind of aspects, or it's the same? You need to kind of treat it in the same way.
Great question. I think in my case, I would probably taken the simplistic route, which is exercising the same skills relative to, as a friend of mine who's a Marine Corps officer, who's now a general, I've known him for 35 years, as he put it, mission mates self. So focus on the mission first, then focus on those around you next, and then finally focus on what your goals are.
Yeah.
So in the context of leadership, that's often characterized as servant leadership. In the same vein, Marine officers eat last when platoons are eating. And that's to ensure that everybody around you is going to be on the same vector and pursuing the same goals. So the outcome is different because in business, in the private sector, you're talking about essentially profitability and revenue. In the public sector, you're talking about something that's really conceptual, which is what is the public good?
And there's no profit in there, is there? So you
that's
can't
right.
on profit. So
there's no measure.
On a kind of a good, like this was good.
That's right. Yeah. And even in the context of, why do people in New York City pay taxes to the federal government to ensure the safety and cleanliness of national parks in Wyoming? Because it's all part of the public good. That's a little different than the private sector objectives. So the manifestation of leadership as a skill and as a choice are going to be a little bit different in that context. But the skill set in my mind is still the same. We're talking about human psychology. We're talking about manifesting change. You're talking about vision. You're also talking about dogged determination. Leaders are often characterized as those with the best vision or the best strength if they're an athlete, or great heroism, in the military context, or great leadership skills, being able to coalesce various disparate forces and groups together in the political context. And then the analysis of that is always, what's the identification or the education behind it, or the evaluation of that individual as though they did it all on their own. But the reality, it's more like a play in the context. If you look at character character development in a play, you have the protagonist, and then all of a sudden you have all these supporting characters that come in and out of the play during the course of 3 acts usually.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing in my view as to manifesting leadership and successful leadership. It's not all about that warrior princess like Joan of Arc, or the man on the white horse, if you will, that comes in and changes everything. It's everybody around him that also becomes a force multiplier, in the words of Colin Powell.
Yeah, and if you look at the companies you've consulted with, and you mentioned obviously going from this kind of small seed level all the way through to a billion-dollar valuation, what are the things that you've seen in the leaders? Obviously, you mentioned a bit about the skill set there, but I talk quite a lot about is good to great. Jim Collins and how you become a great company. What are the sort of things that you've always identified in leaders that you like to work with and help them, that you've seen have driven towards success?
Yeah, I've been at let's say the cuff of a number of exceptional individuals who would be later labeled as leaders, whether they be a U.S. senator or cabinet secretary who was a former professional football player in the United States, or even the youngest naval ensign in World War II became president of the United States. That was George Herbert Walker Bush. The thing that I always identified, which I just recently labeled, which was humility and agility.
Okay.
You can have accomplishments without being arrogant.
Yeah.
And command and control type leadership really doesn't work these type of days. It may have worked in the trenches of World War I or going back to the Roman eras, but that's just not the way society is structured and people are built anymore, and experience that what their experience base is. So that humility aspect is a matter of always exploring what the options are and being open to those options, as opposed to saying, no, this is the way we're going to do it, regardless of what the outcome may be, just because it's my way. Let's call it the king's way or the emperor's way.
Yeah.
As opposed to who puts those coalitions together to be able to manifest a destiny, a direction, without having to manifest or create that command and control perspective. That's just not that effective anymore. And that's, as I say, along the way, I've been able to see guys who actually, and guys, they were men, but I've also worked for great women in the context of, even in telecommunications. My first 2 jobs I held my bosses were women. That ability to be able to coalesce, bring things together, and then be able to guide the group to that objective, which is essentially manifesting change, which is really the most difficult thing when you start. Strategy is easy. It's about the planning and then the execution that gets a little difficult and more sticky, if you will. Yeah.
And it's usually when you've got a lot of different things kind of going on at the same time, is what you mean about agility, isn't it? To be able to jump between different kind of aspects. So one of the things I was quite interested in is, obviously for our kind of listeners just to understand, is when you work as this technology consultant, primarily I believe in the kind of communications space, but so what is it that you do? You can kind of describe the service that you provide, and I'm sure it's quite wide ranging. But
sure, the reality is, in technology, oftentimes technology becomes the core focus with just the nature of the business. I am not educated as an electrical engineer or any type of engineer, period. And the thing that I've always been able to bring, and others have pointed out early in my career in the context of, I'm able to simplify the complexities and put it in a language that's understandable.
Yeah.
Now, the objective there, early on, as a commercial guy carrying a bag, being a sales guy, was that regardless of the environment or the audience that I'm facing, whether they be a chief technology officer or they be a chief commercial officer, I'd be able to develop the right aperture, use the right syntax, be able to put things on the table, not about how it works, but how it serves, how it serves the interests of their customers, not about, okay, this is how we can connect with each other, but how what we do is different and how it makes a difference. And that wasn't, by no means was that the vision when I got into the private sector within the telecommunications world. It was like, okay, this is the job. And then started realizing, wow, this has really monumental impacts on a day-to-day basis, for individuals. And when I was I helped launch one of the first what's called GSM operators in North America, which is essentially a wireless radio interface that, when I say wireless, it comes down to
pre the G's, wasn't it? I remember
you got it.
I used
We're
to
talking about
place
2G.
embedded software engineers there, Paul.
Yeah.
So I in my recruitment consultant days, I did a lot of GSM mobile engineers for companies like Samsung, NEC, those types of companies. So yeah, it was one of my specialist subjects. GSM.
Well, that just demonstrates and reflects the impact that wireless or mobile telecommunications, and I happen to be half French, and when I first got into the business, I was looking around, I was doing product development and business development. I'm like, okay, there's no playbook that I can develop here. No. And out of 250 people in the business, this particular company, about 6 of us actually had 6 people, not me, had actual training or experience in a mobile network operator, and they all came from the UK because they spoke English. They could be recruited to California, to San Francisco region, all that was good. And people were being hired for talent, not necessarily training. Yeah. And as we would call it over here, oftentimes you hire an athlete. Somebody that can play third base, first base, left field, right field, pitch, catch, because of their innate skills. It may not be that they've been trained in that, and even the people who were hiring, making these decisions. I got hired by a guy who had worked at Sega, the gaming company, the electronic gaming company. We're talking about 1996. He didn't have any experience in mobile, and neither did his boss, who had been hired from Gillette.
Wow.
Okay.
I guess that's devices of some type, right?
Yeah, and yet this had been a $3 billion investment just on the wireless spectrum alone for California. So my point in all this is that I started looking at what were the net results for the end consumer, and that became my lodestar. What was I shooting for in the context of convenience? And then later got into the messaging space by accident. And that became phenomenally successful, and I had the right vision in being able to take a company and contribute to taking a company as a startup to a global entity within about a year. My model was going global from the start, laid out the strategy relative to why this would be accretive downstream or be more competitive, and as Reid Hoffman has put it in his book, blitzscaling. I was doing this about a decade before the book came out, but it's the same approach, which is instead of focusing on going from 0 to 1, like the minimally viable product, that's been talked about in startups oftentimes, our vision was we want to go from 0 to 1 billion. But we also knew that we had considerable advantages because the architecture of mobile telecommunications, or telecommunications overall, has network effects. So we knew that we would be accelerating, and even in the context, there's a great concept called Metcalfe's Law, which talks about the value of the network geometrically increases with the addition of each node. Yeah. What that translates into reality is that each subscriber adds more to the network than just their current or their level value. It's the interconnectivity that they then provide. And if you start talking about network of networks, which is what I was involved in creating, that gets really big, really fast.
Yeah, so it's that kind of complexity of it, and that almost kind of one machine that the human race, as it were, has developed in order to build something astonishing. Really, is the kind of and you're going to go into the new methods of using kind of Internet of Things, that sort of stuff, and machine learning aspects. It's all based around kind of the telecommunications network, right? You need to have that communications background or platform to make this work.
Exactly. And now the space that I'm involved in is called Communications Platforms as a Service, called CPaaS, which is essentially you're lashing together a number of these different platforms. So you become a platform of platforms.
Yeah.
And so what are the platforms? Well, we've been talking about SMS, which is kind of the foundation of most CPaaS providers. And then from there, you include voice, And what we're doing now relative to video, which is a recent enhancement to our convenience levels, working from home and everything else in the context of a pandemic. And then you look at OTT, and you look at artificial intelligence and machine learning, such as chatbots. And then you even look at the old style email functionality. And a number of CPaaS providers are now going after email companies, most recently. And we're talking about upwards of $1 billion, $2 billion for essentially an old style legacy communications network. But the objective is to have all these functionalities so that you and I can choose on our own when we want to connect, how we want to connect, via what type of platform that's most convenient for us. And the enterprises, who essentially are our servants of sorts, then say, okay, we've got to have all this functionality. And that's what drives the dynamics of the industry.
It's like I said, as a recruiter, I've been involved in that kind of telecommunications community, as it were, since I started. And the first placements I made, I think, was with Lucent, if you know what I mean. So
of course,
back in there, and
Alcatel, and then Alcatel-Lucent, and then Ericsson and Nokia, all these,
all these names that kind of still, they're still in existence, aren't they? But they've kind of, they're still kind of happening. And so for you, obviously, thinking into your market and thinking into the types of kind of companies that you're working with and consulting, what do you see as the priorities for this year? Obviously, the market opportunity, as the way we interact with telecommunications, has changed so much in the last kind of even months. So what do you see as the main opportunities for the businesses you're consulting with to grow and to prosper and to help customers?
Yeah, so to be very narrow and specific, the objective is regional expansion. And when we're talking about many of these companies, we've gone through a 20+ year evolution of the space, and it's now become revitalized as a result of the pandemic and the behavior of consumers. And so what's happening is that offshore companies, and I'm referring from a European or an American perspective, these offshore companies that started off 10, 15 years ago have gotten much bigger. And they realize that they need to get into these larger markets, these more developed markets, i.e. Western Europe, i.e. the United States and North America. So that's one vector that some of my clients have engaged me for. Another vector is essentially, how do they decide whether they're going to be predator or bait? Because of the dynamics of, as I mentioned earlier, there's consolidation. These companies have gotten to higher levels of maturity. Many of them gone public, and they could have gone public in Europe on the AIM exchange, or they might have gone the India Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, whatever. And now they've got dry powder, as they say, and they're looking to be able to get bigger faster.
Yeah, that's right. Take this opportunity, as it were.
That's right. And get bigger, get faster means that, as I mentioned earlier, where are they going to go off and acquire these companies, or where are they going to go off and build out their revenue stream to be able to maintain their competitive posture? And then the last piece, which is not the least priority, but just in our discussion, is how do they marshal and identify innovation on a evolutionary basis? Because there's very few things that are going on that it's revolutionary. There's no new iPhone just around the corner, or the rumor of such a thing.
I guess the Metaverse, that sort of thing, that's kind of like
I'll give you that.
Is it developed enough? It's obviously, it's kind of there, and people are starting to talk about it. And I guess it's just a different mode of delivering communication, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah, I'd give you all of that, but I'd also be looking at, the reality is, what cohort are they going after?
Yeah, that's right.
And there's still so many issues. Maybe it's because I'm an old guy. It's not something I usually do in terms of.
Gives me a headache.
Exactly, makes me nauseated. I've now
they need
granted
to work out a way of me not having a headache when I do
exactly. And even in that same context, I've gone through a demo once, which was about 2-3 years ago at Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress, and I felt off for the next hour and a half. And that was what was it, that was the way, that's what it was attributed to in my mind. It just didn't come around and then it went away. That was a problem. I can't see me doing that.
Yeah, my daughters, I somehow got an Oculus for free from a supplier, which is great. Thank you very much to Credersi. But obviously, I can see the uses of it. But my daughters like playing on it. But yeah, when I try it, I'm not a great lover of it. And so I guess that's how the technology needs to develop first, is that it becomes a non-invasive technology. I know people say, oh, it feels like you're like in this different world, but I know I'm wearing a funny headset and that gives me a headache. So maybe I'm just moaning,
Yeah, like I say, I opened up with I'm an old guy, in the context of it just doesn't move me. But then the reality is, okay, so let's put on a business, lens here in the context of what's the real viability of this, given the narrow market that we're going to be going after. Is everyone going to be changing that fast? I mean, text messaging is a great example of a phenomenal success, global tsunami in the course of a decade,
That's right.
And
which continues with WhatsApp.
That's right. Back to, even in the context of what we call enterprise messaging, it's measured in the teens of trillions of units, meaning messages being sent on an annual basis. And then even in the context of, let's say 4 years ago, pre-pandemic, you and I might have been talking, like some of my financial clients, banks, investment banks, private equity firms are like, okay, so we see like a 3.8, 4% growth rate. That's not great, but we're willing to make this investment. What do you see over the horizon? Well, this is kind of like turning into an S curve. We're going to have to find some differentiator. Pandemic comes around. All of a sudden, enterprise messaging is growing at 30% globally.
It's amazing.
Yeah, with a projection that it's going to be at least 3+ years at that rate. And I've even confirmed that with other colleagues of mine who now run sales organizations globally. And I'm like, okay, so what's your nut for next year, for 2022? And the answer is, well, 43%, 40%. I'm like, whoa.
I mean, we did a roundtable yesterday, and obviously we're all tech and talking to different types of software, communications, hardware, and there's such a buzz about the market at the moment because everything is becoming more digital and it's all kind of coming back. The older technologies, the newer technologies, it's just how we live today, isn't it? So
that's right.
Yeah, I think, just to go on the Metaverse side, I think for me, it's the sort of thing that I believe we're at the start of it now, right now as we speak, in the same way as maybe like GSM or something like that was like kind of the start.
Yeah,
that was like the precursor to the iPhone. So you're not really going to see it, really kind of kick in. But it's interesting to see kind of what happens. And when you go into, these businesses, what are the main pieces of advice that you give when sitting down, my consultancy, understand the business a little bit more? What do you tell them? How do you?
So my model is very simple, not very complicated. I'm usually brought in to help facilitate a vision or to help drive more tactical changes, i.e. sales, etc. So I always start with this, which is, let's start with the answer. What do you want to be? Yep. And now let's take a snapshot of where you are today. And that's not just a conversation, that's usually a workshop, lasts a whole day. And many times it's like the business guys and the technologists, whether it's the product team, everybody's in the same room, and even the finance, if I can, to be able to establish a benchmark. So we all have the same vision of where do we want to go? And then what do we have today? And then doing the gap analysis. And how are we going to get there? What resources? So resources in my mind are, I learned this running political campaigns: time, money, people, meaning the number of people you can throw at a problem; talent, the type and caliber of the people that you can throw at a talent at a problem; time, money, people, talent, will. How committed are you to this? Then money. But there's one other piece that I learned after the political world, which was technology. Technology can accelerate all these. But of those 7 factors, there's only one that cannot be created or cannot be recaptured, and that's time.
And I guess that's where the answer comes in, right? Kind of, is this worth it? Is it worth us putting our resources in for this? I guess that's it.
That's the nub as to, okay, this is your vision. Sure, let's go to Mars. All right, all grand, all good. Now, what is it going to take for us to go to Mars?
Have you? Are you as rich as?
How are you exactly?
Elon Musk,
trillions of dollars, and what are we going to do with these human beings? Is it going to take 8 years in a spaceship, or something equivalent to that? Is that really viable? Is that within your risk profile? And then being able to hash that out, and then again, what are the options? Not necessarily the plan, but what are the options that we want to pursue, whether it's low, medium, high projections, growth rates, or what are the different strategies that we can employ, whether it's acquisition, buy, build, rent, however you want to characterize it, or what regions do we want to go after first relative to this is our global vision. We have a great position, let's say in India, like one of my clients has, and how do we, discern where we want to go next?
Yeah, and it's having that plan, that structure, and that strategy, isn't it? And I guess working with someone like yourself who has seen it before, so can obviously use some of that experience, as it were, within the industry, but also within leadership. Yeah, that's the hope. Yeah.
Well, I try not to trade on everything that I've done in the past. It kind of enriches my perspective of the present and helps project a vision to the future. And every time I've done something, I always take a lesson away. Even in, like, again, back to the political world, it was always about, you don't want to run the same campaign twice, just like you don't want to run the same war twice, because things change. So you got to be agile enough to understand over the horizon dynamics are different this time around and adjust to that. So,
So, obviously thinking about a particular kind of area and sector that you work in, and obviously it's a very exciting time for communications and, the different players within it. What do you see are the, we talked a little bit about the innovation. What do you see as the key kind of innovations that's going to drive this forward now? What gets you excited about the communications industry?
I think we're going through a transformation as a result of, obviously, the impact of COVID. And you start breaking down the different platforms that are now being employed. In the last 2 years, I've gone through and this is just because I got a brand new key light and a brand new camera. And this is the second go around. The first one I had this little tiny light.
It's a good camera there, Paul. You're very, very clear, very.
Exactly. As soon as I plugged in, I'm like, wow, and it was because a friend of mine was like, you look washed out. Maybe you want to improve your camera. And I'm like, okay, let's go do that. And this one is almost like 4K quality. But you get the idea in the context. These are various changes that are going on at a smaller level, at a micro level, that now are going to have a macro impact. And specifically, for example, evolution of 5G. If you talk to a consumer, if you're over here, you could be watching American football on TV, and you're going to see a Verizon commercial or T-Mobile commercial, all talking about 5G. And when you and I first got in this business, we were talking about 2G. Well, ask your average consumer, what does 5G mean? What does it actually mean? And the reality is, it's just higher speed, better video. The real jump in terms of the transformation that I'm kind of excited is, and all those other ripple effects. So things like conversational commerce that I'm involved in, which is essentially these various platforms that are going to make banking and making purchasing even easier as a consumer. And managing logistics, all those things then become much more integrated. Even smart buildings, which was, an offshoot of IoT. My first IoT experience was in 1998 when what was then VoiceStream, which is now known as T-Mobile US, was doing an SMS notification between a watering system, an agricultural watering system in Colorado Springs, Colorado, to the farmer cooperative. And the whole idea was it was all based on SMS. So that was the first Internet of Things solution, because SMS, it's telecommunications, it's not the actual web itself, but this was the interface that was going on. And now we've got even more powerful interconnectivity as a result of where we are in 5G. And then the next stage is, recently I was in a conversation with a technologist who was telling me, I need your insight on commercial impacts of 6G. And I was like, okay, do you have a white paper on this? Because while I'm writing the white paper, I'm like, well, as soon as you have it done, send it over, because obviously I need to read it.
Then I'll tell you what I think.
Yeah, I'm not even digesting 5G. And here we are talking about 6G. But that's the vendor cycle. I mean, you and I both know this. I remember WAP in 2G to 3G and Edge. These are the things that were being bandied about at the same time around Bluetooth. Which of those three has survived? Bluetooth.
Who thought that?
Exactly. So the directions are oftentimes unintended and unexpected. Yes, they can be projected out, but most of the time we start having these experiences as a result of our interaction and use of these devices. So,
and I guess as well, when you think about 5G, 6G, that sort of thing, it's also it's an element of global infrastructure, which comes back to something we talked about. So it's a public sector things, like, are we, there's a big conversation in the UK. Is BT going to roll this out? When are they going to roll this out? And
exactly,
and they're generally like, it makes this country, not even a company, but makes a country or a location more competitive, doesn't it, in the kind of global
absolutely
market?
This all plays out in terms of the ripple effects, what you guys would call the knock-on effects, relative to the competitiveness. I live in Washington, D.C., and I also have a prior career in public policy. So I get feeds from, I think it's called the ITF, the Internet Technology Foundation, which looks at the impact of technology on domestic GDP in the US and other countries. And then the next stage of that conversation is the competitive positioning of the US and the architecture of its telecommunications capabilities against other countries. Well, what's the other countries right now? China. And what's going on? That's right. And again, because of the nature of the business that I've been in, and I've traveled and done business in 80 countries now over the last 25 years. I remember the first time I went to Korea and I was just astounded. And this was in 1999, 2000, in terms of the speeds of the internet and everything else that was so interconnected. Now the US, we're just coming around to it. And I even have a friend who is in a government entity, and his whole posture, his whole profile is looking to be able to expand broadband as wide as possible in unconnected or unlighted rural areas, as well as urban communities. And then the knock-on effects. Well, that means that we're finally catching up with the Koreans.
That's right. And also the space the US has. I mean, a lot of the companies that we deal with are pretty much, you can work anywhere and do work wherever you want. We obviously work in the tech space, right? Which is a very much a kind of social change, isn't it? This is networks driving social change. In terms of, well, you could go and live in Idaho if you wanted to. Sorry, Idaho, but you can work for a New York company. Sometimes they're trying to earn a New York salary, but they don't always get to. But you can work for a New York company, but be in Idaho. And this is such a huge change, isn't it? And that's obviously linking into that kind of that technology infrastructure that's so important for everyone, really, everywhere.
Exactly. And there are two data points that I have as real live people. A friend of mine who is a consultant in London, he happens to be German, and during the pandemic and the lockdown, he moved to Senegal.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was, I'm looking at his video feed, I'm like, that looks different than the last place you were at. Did you change apartments? Or he's like, no. And he turns the camera, and I'm looking through his bedroom sliding glass doors, and about 100 feet is a beach.
Yeah, wow, fantastic.
Right on, and I'm like, where are you? Oh, I'm in Senegal.
I
And then
bet
I've got another
you
friend.
still couldn't guess it was in Senegal though if you did go and
Well,
take
yeah,
it.
and so we then have the conversation. So you're in a 4-bedroom villa and it's costing you roughly 1,500
Yeah, I
pounds. And
know.
it's like, my
In the
God,
yeah
it's crazy.
same time zone as Europe, Yeah,
Exactly the
yeah,
point when I was like, why Senegal? I was like, it's pretty close to the European time zone. My masters are in London. There's no office in the
yeah.
wasn't open at
French
the time. We're
speaking.
talking about
Yeah,
18 months ago. All
yeah.
those things. And then I've got a
Mm,
friend who's a son of another of a friend of mine
mm,
who's 25, and he works for Databricks. He lives in San Francisco. He's one of these tech bros that got a
mm.
computer science degree, the whole 9 yards. He's rode this wave really well. And he's lived in New York, Hawaii, Seattle, uh, Dallas, and he's now back in New York again, even though he's
Mm.
got a place specifically in San Francisco. And that's all in the
Yeah,
last like 18 months.
yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? It's very
Yeah.
exciting, and I genuinely think that as we kind of go forward, and obviously you're very much involved in that industry, that the things that can be kind of created and provided are just huge and continue to be so. And it's as exciting as when we were kind of working on GSM to now when it's 6G or whatever.
Yeah, this is great. I've been
Yeah.
slogging in the trenches for the last few years, and I'm like, this is a great conversation because you've essentially given me some lift as to, yeah, there's hope for tomorrow.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, it's very interesting. So obviously, just as we kind of look to finish up our conversation, Paul, thanks very much for your time today. What are your kind of key things? We talk a lot about leadership here. So what are the key things you've learned as a leader, um, in the last few years, I think, because obviously, let's be honest, it's kind of quite a long career as a leader. So what have you particularly learned in the last few years that, like you said, have been kind of light bulb moments for you?
You know, um, it's as much a choice. Well, it is a choice
Mm.
to be able to put yourself forward. There's a lot of fear around that for many people.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm, a little bit long in the tooth at this stage, but I can look back at my career and my journey in life, and there are now patterns that I see that have been exposed as a result of being repetitious,
Mm.
in the context of, okay, I see what I did there, and now I'm doing the same thing here.
Yeah.
And it goes back to making that choice. How
Mm.
do you become a leader? And in my case, were the things where, that dogged determination, as I mentioned earlier,
Mm.
when I was a junior and a sophomore in high school, I used to play soccer on a soccer team in high school, and we used to have to run killers. I don't know if
Yeah.
they have this in the UK, but killers are, you're on a soccer pitch, first line, second line, third
Yeah.
line,
Yeah.
midfield,
Yeah.
fourth line, fifth line, sixth line, and then do that not once, but twice. So they were called killers.
Yeah.
And I got to the point where I'm like, and some guys would hang back and, wouldn't want to do the first run. My perspective was, I want to get this done. Okay.
Yeah.
If this is so
Yeah.
painful, I want to get it done, not wait and watch. So get to the front of the line,
Mm.
so I started doing that. And as a result, it became a recognition of, yeah, the grinder is out there. He's doing it again. He's getting
Doing
first in
stuff.
line.
Yeah.
And that was my mentality. Get
Mm.
first in line, get it done. And as a result, I got chosen to be captain of the soccer team when I was in high school.
Sure.
That was a manifestation of just my personality. And then later, seeing that and then studying it, I had the opportunity in graduate school. We were talking about this. There's a great course at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University called Leadership.
Mm.
And it's as I was characterizing it earlier, it's a knife fight between the guys and men and women from the business school, the law school, and the Kennedy School, which is
Get into
the
this. Yeah.
commercial guys, the legal guys, and the political guys
Mm.
all fighting to get into this class.
Yeah.
And looking at it in that context. So you hear about imposter syndrome. Put that aside. Put yourself out there. Because just by putting yourself out there, you're already halfway to your goal.
Yeah.
And whatever your goal may be, as I mentioned earlier, mission mates self.
Mm.
And if that's not your mentality, that's okay, whatever your mentality is. But the first step is put yourself out there. And don't be
Yeah.
afraid, because in the end, it'll just make you stronger.
Fantastic. Well, on that fantastic and that inspirational note, Paul, I'm gonna say thank you very much for your time. Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll catch up again. It's interesting to.
I'd
I'm
be happy to
interested to
talk to
see
you. I
how
mean,
the
David,
communication world
we
goes
can go
on.
on and on. You know, for those of you really interested, I mean, I'm right now. There's a great book that I'm reading by a former general named Stanley McChrystal, who
Yeah.
teaches a course
Okay.
on leadership at Yale University, and you know, it's called Leaders. And if you're really interested, check that out. He also wrote
Fantastic.
another book called Teams of Teams, as to being able to manage these large ecosystems. Great read. Great read.
Brilliant. Well, we'll post up those links in the post.
Okay.
Lovely. Fantastic. Paul, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, David. I really enjoyed it.
Soon.
Thanks for the opportunity to invite me and have the conversation with your listeners.
No problem. Have a great day.